The afternoon light is doing something particular today. You noticed it a little while ago, the way it comes through the small window above the drying rack and falls not in one clean stripe, as it does in summer, but in a wide, pale wash, as though it has spread itself thin to cover as much of the room as it can before it goes. Autumn light. The kind that knows it is running out of time and chooses, rather than rushing, to simply linger as gently as it can. The potion shop on Sable Street smells the way it always smells at this hour. Beeswax from the candles on the counter. The faint sweetness of dried chamomile, coming from the long bunches hanging above the second shelf on the left. Something warmer underneath. Amber resin, maybe, from the little jar you opened earlier to measure out a half portion for a clarity tincture. And under all of it, the smell of the shop itself. Old wood worn smooth where your hands rest most often, and the particular mineral coolness of the stone floor. You are standing at the work table. You have been standing here for a while, doing what you often do at this hour, which is not quite one thing. Your hands move without needing instruction. A small glass bottle, rinsed and dried. A cork pressed gently in until it settles with that soft, satisfying click. A label written in your careful hand, not hurried, not pressed too hard, set aside to dry. Another bottle. Another cork. Another label. Outside, the harbour bell rings 4 times. The sound comes through the wall and through the window and through you, the way it always does, and settles somewhere low in your chest where familiar things settle. 4 o'clock. The light agrees. The town is at that particular hour between the midday bustle and the supper-hour quiet, when Thistlewick breathes a little more slowly, and so do you. You set the last labelled bottle on the shelf to your right. The shelf has a slight lean to it, has always had a slight lean to it, tilting just a few degrees toward the window, as though curious about what is happening outside on Sable Street. You have never fixed it. You have thought about fixing it, on several occasions, in the vague way one thinks about things that are not quite problems. But the bottles have learned to account for it over time, and so have you, and there is something quietly pleasing about that. The shelf knows the bottles. The bottles know the shelf. You step back and look at your work. The afternoon's labelling is done. A row of amber-glass bottles with round stoppers, each one filled with something slightly different from the last. A sleep draught, pale gold and faintly luminous in the light. A grief-ease tincture, deep violet, still as water in the bottle. 3 small vials of the clarity tonic, clear as river water, though it is not water, and you know better than to ever mistake it for such. And on the end, the one you worked on longest today. The warmth draught, which is not for the body's temperature, but for the feeling of warmth, the memory of it, the sense that someone somewhere is thinking of you with care. It is the colour of late afternoon, amber and gold, and something that is almost, but not quite, orange. You made that one well today. You can tell by the colour. When it comes out that particular shade, the warmth draught has done exactly what it is meant to do, settled into something true, something that will taste like good news and feel like a hand on the shoulder. When it comes out paler, it still works, but more distantly, like warmth from across a room. Today's batch is close enough to touch. You allow yourself a small, quiet satisfaction about this. Then you move to put the kettle on. The small brazier in the back corner of the shop is the one you use for heating water, not for making potions, Potions are made over the larger flame on the main work table, with a different kind of attention. The brazier is for tea, and for warming the shop on mornings when the stone floor is particularly cold, and for the general comfort of having a small fire nearby while you work. You fill the kettle from the jug beside it, the water making a low, satisfied sound as it goes in. The metal of the kettle is warm from where it has been sitting near the brazier all afternoon, and the handle is smooth in your palm, worn to the shape of a hand that has held it many thousands of times. You set it over the flame and listen to it begin its slow work, the first small sounds, almost nothing, almost like breathing. While the kettle heats, you walk the length of the shop. This is another thing you do without thinking, a kind of inventory that is more sensory than practical, running your eyes along the shelves, letting your hand trail the edge of the counter, checking in with the room in the way you might check in with a friend at the end of a long day. Everything in its place. Everything accounted for. The shelves run from floor to ceiling on the east wall, the bottles arranged not strictly by type, but by some system that has evolved over years and now lives entirely in your muscle memory. You could reach for the grief ease in the dark. You have, in fact, on at least 2 occasions, and you found it both times without knocking anything over. The arrangement is not logical to anyone else. It is logical to you and to the shop, and that is enough. The west wall has the herbs. Not all of them. Most of the dried stock is in the back room, in the cool and the dark where it keeps best. But the west wall has the ones in current use, hanging in long bunches from iron hooks in the ceiling beams. Chamomile in 2 varieties, valerian, passion flower, lemon balm, lavender from the Greenmere family's garden on Fenwick Lane, and high on the topmost hook, barely reachable, the dried thistle that gives the town its name and that you use sparingly, in very small amounts, in very particular preparations. It blooms in summer on the hillsides above the harbour. By autumn it is dry and purple and faintly sharp-smelling, the way the whole season is faintly sharp. You pause under the lavender. It is your favourite smell in the shop. Not the most useful herb, not the one you reach for most often, but the one that makes the air around it feel softer. Standing under it is like standing in a room where someone has recently said something kind. The kettle begins to whistle, low and steady. You go back to the brazier and pour the water into the small clay teapot that lives beside it, the brown one with the chip on the lid that has been there since you can remember. The chip does not affect anything. The lid fits perfectly despite it. You have always liked that. Chamomile tonight. You take a small pinch of the loose flowers from the jar beside the teapot and add them to the strainer, then set the lid on, chip and all, and let it steep. The shop settles around you. Outside, Sable Street is quiet. You can hear it distantly, the sound of footsteps on the cobblestones, someone's cartwheel, the faint call of a voice from the direction of Market Square. But it is all muffled by distance and by the walls of the shop, which are old and thick and good at holding the world gently at bay. Inside, there is only the slow drip of the tea steeping, the occasional soft pop from the brazier, and the ambient stillness of many small glass bottles sitting very quietly on their shelves. You pour the tea. The steam rises and curls in the pale afternoon light, and you wrap both hands around the mug, the blue one, which is your favourite for this time of day because of the way it holds heat, and you take the first sip. It tastes like the end of the afternoon, like everything that needed doing has been done, and what remains is only the good part. You spend the next little while doing the smaller work. There is always smaller work in the shop. It is not urgent, and it is not particularly important, but it is the kind of work that keeps things running smoothly without anyone ever noticing, which is, you have come to believe, the highest form of maintenance. You wipe down the counter with the damp cloth. You straighten the row of measuring spoons hanging from their hook on the side of the shelving unit. You check the supply of small corks and find them adequate, which is all you ask of them. You move one of the clarity tinctures from the back of the shelf to the front, where the light will catch it and make it look interesting to anyone who comes in. The measuring spoons deserve a particular moment of attention. There are 7 of them, ranging from the large, wide as your palm, for the coarser ingredients, down to the very small, barely a thumbnail, for things that required precision and restraint. They hang from a row of small iron hooks in the order you always hang them, largest to smallest, left to right. Someone had carved very faint notches into the handles long ago, in a hand that was not yours, to indicate the measures. 1 notch for a half measure, 2 for a quarter, 3 for an eighth. You had not carved them and did not know who had, but you used them every day, and the notches had worn a little deeper over time from the passing of your thumb across them. Small things, carried forward. You run your thumb across them now. 1 notch, 2, 3, the way you often did, the way that felt almost like conversation with whoever had stood here before you, measuring the same things by the same small marks. Then you go to the herbs. The west wall needs less attention than the east shelves. The bunches are hanging where they should be, drying slowly, doing nothing visible but doing it correctly. Still, you walk the length of them with your nose, which is the real instrument for this task. You bend your head toward the chamomile first, breathing in the faint sweet apple smell, checking without thinking for any sign of dampness or must, any suggestion that the drying isn't going properly. Fine. Good. The chamomile is doing exactly what chamomile does. The valerian next. Valerian has a smell that divides people sharply. There are those who find it unpleasant, earthy, faintly animal, something old about it. And there are those, and you count yourself among them, who find it deeply reassuring, the way certain old things are reassuring not in spite of their age, but because of it. The valerian smells like something that has been working quietly for a very long time, like something reliable. You breathe it in. Fine. Good. Lemon balm is next, which smells nothing like lemon and nothing like balm, but like something entirely itself. Fresh and a little green and faintly sweet, like a meadow that has decided to be useful. Then the passion flower, which is subtler, its smell more suggestion than declaration. Then the lavender, which you have already visited tonight, but visit again because the lavender is always worth it. You stand under the lavender for a breath longer than necessary. There is a particular property to this moment, this one now in the shop at this hour. Not remarkable, not special in any way that requires naming. Just the accumulated rightness of being in a room you know completely, doing work that matters in small ways, at the end of an afternoon that has gone the way afternoons should go in Thistlewick. Gently, with company, with the satisfaction of useful things made and properly given. You let yourself feel it without examining it too closely. Then you move one of the clarity tinctures from the back of the shelf to the front, where the light will catch it and make it look interesting to anyone who comes in. People often buy the clarity tincture impulsively, when they see how the light moves through it. You have never tried to manufacture this effect. It simply happens that the clarity tincture is clear, and light behaves a certain way with clear things, and people are drawn to light the way they always have been, and so sometimes they come in for one thing and leave with a clarity tincture as well, slightly surprised at themselves and not entirely sure why they wanted it. But they almost always come back to say it helped, that it made things feel a little less muddled, that they slept better the night they took it, or that the problem they'd been turning over in their mind for a week had suddenly seemed, if not simple, then at least manageable. You think that is what the clarity tincture does, actually. Not make things simple, just manageable. You finish your tea. The light has shifted. Not much, it is still afternoon, still that same wide, pale wash, but it has moved a few degrees toward the window, so that the stripe it makes on the floor has lengthened, reaching almost to the foot of the central shelving unit now. An hour ago it barely touched the counter. You could track the whole afternoon by where that stripe of light falls, if you had a mind to. You set the mug down on the counter and look toward the door. The door to the potion shop on Sable Street is an old one. Its wood is dark with age, and the hinges are large and made of iron that has been oiled so many times over so many years that it has developed a particular color, not quite black and not quite brown, like something that has been thoroughly lived in. The sign in the window, hand-painted, a little faded, reading open in letters you repainted yourself 2 winters ago, hangs slightly crooked, as it always does. You have straightened it several times. It always returns to crooked. You have accepted this about the sign. The door opens. The small bell above it chimes, a light, clear sound, like a single note struck on a glass, and Marin comes in. She comes in the way she always comes in, which is the way people come into a place they have been coming into for a very long time, without announcement, without particular ceremony, already half in the middle of a thought. Her coat is the deep green one, the wool one she starts wearing when the nights turn cold, which means the nights have turned cold. You had noticed this yourself this morning when you walked from your rooms above the shop down to open up, but seeing Marin's coat confirms it in a different way, a more social way. The fog came in this morning and never quite went, she said, pulling the coat a little closer for a moment before it occurred to her she was inside now, and then loosening it again. It didn't, you agreed. You were already moving toward the kettle, because Marin usually came in around this time, and she usually wanted tea, though she rarely asked for it directly. The light's been strange all day, wide and low. Autumn light, she said. Autumn light, you confirmed. She moved to the stool at the end of the counter, the one that had been there, in that spot, for as long as either of you could clearly remember, though neither of you had placed it there deliberately. It had simply migrated to that position over the years and stayed. Marin settled onto it with the practised ease of someone who has occupied a particular stool many hundreds of times, and she set her small cloth bag on the counter beside her, and she looked at the row of new bottles you'd labelled this afternoon. "The warmth draught," she said, noticing the amber-gold one on the end. "Good batch today." She looked at it for a moment. "I can tell," she said. "The colour." This was one of the things you liked most about Marin. She knew things without being told. Not magic, just attention. She had been paying close attention to this shop for a long time, and it showed, the way any long practice shows. Quietly, in small ways, in the things she noticed and the things she did not need to ask. You filled the kettle again and set it over the flame. "I need more of the sleep draught," she said, after a comfortable pause. "The small size. The one in the round bottle. For yourself. For Willa." She was quiet a moment. "She's had 3 bad nights running. Won't say what's on her mind, but you can see it in her. That particular kind of tiredness that isn't about sleep." You nodded. You knew the kind. The tiredness that comes not from too little sleep, but from too much that runs through the night, too much that follows the dreaming down. You reached for the shelf where the sleep draughts lived. Second shelf, east wall, clustered near the chamomile because you had noticed long ago that their effects complemented each other and that people who needed one often needed the other, and brought down a small round-stoppered bottle of the pale gold. "1 vial should be enough for 3 nights," you said, setting it on the counter in front of her. "A quarter measure in warm water before bed. Nothing bitter. It tastes like nothing mostly. A little sweet. Willa won't like it if it tastes medicinal." "It doesn't." "Good." She picked it up and turned it in her fingers, and the light through the little window caught it and made it glow briefly. "She'd been better, you know, for a stretch. Since the harvest fair. Something about the fair agreed with her. The harvest fair agrees with most people. Marin set the bottle down again and let her hands rest on the counter. "There's something about a whole town eating together in one place." The kettle began to warm up again, and you turned to fetch the chamomile. There was enough in the strainer for another cup, and refilled the pot. The shop was quiet around the 2 of you. Not an uncomfortable quiet. The kind that happens between people who have known each other long enough that silence is simply another form of conversation. Outside, a pair of footsteps passed on Sable Street, unhurried, fading. "How is the shop?" Marin asked. "Good," you said. "Busy this week. People sensing the change. They always do, this time of year." She was right. There was something about the turning toward cold that made people want things from you. Not remedies, exactly. Not most of them. More like reassurance in a bottle. Something to hold. The warmth draught sold better in autumn than in any other season, and the grief-ease tincture moved more steadily through October and November than all the rest of the year combined, and you had your theories about why, though you had never stated them to anyone directly. People feel the shortening of the light. They feel the year beginning to close. And they come in, quietly, without quite saying what they're looking for, and they stand at the counter, and they look at the shelves, and they wait for something to catch their eye. Often it does. You poured the tea and set Marin's cup in front of her, the yellow mug, the one she always used when she visited. "Thank you," she said, and wrapped her hands around it. You talked for a while, the way you always did at this hour, about nothing urgent and everything important. Marin told you that the Fenwick bakery had started making the autumn spice bread again, the dense, dark loaf that only appeared in October, the one that smelled like the whole month concentrated into a single thing. She had walked past the bakery that morning, and the smell had reached her halfway down the lane, and she had stopped walking for a moment, she said, just to breathe it in, because some smells are worth stopping for. You agreed with this. You told her that the morning had been quiet in the shop, unusually so, just 2 customers in the first 2 hours, which occasionally happened and which you had long ago stopped trying to explain or predict. The shop had its own rhythms, independent of any logic you could trace. Some mornings the door barely closed between visitors. Some mornings you could read half a book. What did you read? Marin asked. You thought about it. I wasn't really reading, actually. I was thinking while holding a book. She nodded at this, as though it were a perfectly complete answer, which it was. She told you about old Rennick down at the harbour, who had finally repainted his boat after 3 years of talking about it, and that he had chosen a deep red, which surprised everyone who had expected blue. He was very pleased with the red. He was, in fact, so pleased with it that he had stood on the dock for nearly an hour after finishing, just looking at it. Red was the right choice, you said. Everyone thinks so now, Marin said. But nobody would have chosen it for him. You thought about this, about how often the right choice for something is not the one anyone else would make, and how it was only right once the person had made it. The red that no one would have suggested for Rennick's boat was, now that it existed, obviously and perfectly Rennick's boat. The rightness came after the choice, not before it. He's been painting it for 3 years in his imagination, you said. Every colour. He had already eliminated all the wrong ones. Marin considered this over her tea. That does sound like Rennick, she said. She told you about the new family who had moved into the old Carrow house at the top of Fenwick Lane, a quiet couple with a small girl who collected flat stones and left them in careful rows on the garden wall. They had not come into town much yet, but they waved from their gate when you passed. The woman had a vegetable garden she had started late in the season, too late for most things, but the kale and the late turnips were coming in, and she had been out in it every morning that Marin had walked by. Give them until spring, you said. I expect so. People need a winter first, I think, before a place starts to feel like theirs. The first winter is important, you agreed. You had thought about this before, about the particular function of a first winter in a new place, how it did something that the other seasons couldn't. Spring was too easy, summer too full, autumn too nostalgic. But winter required a person to stay, to manage, to keep warm, to find their routes through a cold and quiet town. A place that you had survived a winter in was different from a place you had only enjoyed in good weather. Willa had a hard first winter here, Marin said after a pause. I remember. I sometimes wonder if she ever quite stopped having it, in some part of herself. She held her mug with both hands and looked at the middle distance, not unhappily, but with the particular expression of someone sitting with a thought they've been sitting with for a while. She loves it here. She wouldn't leave for anything. But there's a part of her that still finds the winters long. The sleep draught will help, you said. For now. For now, Marin agreed. She refilled her own cup from the small pot on the counter. She had learned, over many years of visiting, to do this without asking, and you had never once minded. Tell me about what you're making. You have that look. What look? The one where you're slightly elsewhere, making something in your head. You smiled. Something for the edge of sleep. Not the sleep draught. Something softer. For the in-between. She looked at you over her mug. The in-between is the nicest part, she said. I know. I'm trying to bottle it. She was quiet for a moment, thinking about this. What would it taste like? I don't know yet. Something mild. Not bitter. Possibly floral. You thought about the linden flowers, which you hadn't told her about yet. Something that tastes like it was grown near water. Marin nodded slowly. When you've made it, I'll try it. You always try things. That's how you know if they work, she said simply. This was true. Marin had been, over the years, a more reliable testing ground for your less conventional preparations than anyone else in the town, not because she volunteered, exactly, but because she trusted you completely, which meant that when you said you'd made something you wanted to try, she would take it without excessive questioning, and she would come back a week later with an honest account of what had happened, and her account was always useful. She had no tendency to tell you what you wanted to hear. If something hadn't worked, she would say so, matter-of-factly, without apology, and you had always found this more valuable than compliments. The afternoon light had shifted again, lower now, and warmer, the particular deep gold of late autumn sun dropping toward the harbour. The stripe on the floor had reached the base of the shelving unit and begun to climb it, touching the feet of the bottles on the lowest shelf and making them glow. Marin finished her tea. "I should get back," she said. "I told Willa I'd bring supper." She reached into her bag and brought out the small coin purse she kept for the shop, a particular one, embroidered with tiny ferns, that she had used for this purpose for as long as you could remember. You named the price of the sleep draught, which was fair. She counted the coins into her palm and slid them across the counter, and you took them with the same small, practiced movement you always used, the movement that was not quite formal but not quite casual either, the movement that meant, "This is a transaction between us, and I receive it with care." Marin stood, straightened her coat. "The weather will turn before the end of the week," she said. It was not a guess. Marin knew whether the way she knew most things, by paying close attention over a very long time. Rain. Rain first. Then the first frost after. You nodded. "I'll bring in the window herbs tomorrow. She picked up the small bottle and tucked it into her bag with the careful attention she gave to everything. Then she looked at you. "You're well, though." It was not really a question. "I'm well," you said. She nodded, satisfied, and pulled her coat closed again. "Good evening, then." "Good evening, Marin." The bell above the door chimed once as she went out, and then Sable Street swallowed her footsteps, and the shop was its own quiet self again. You stood at the counter for a moment, not moving, simply being in the room. This was something you had developed over years of running the shop, this particular stillness after a visitor left, this moment of letting the room resettle around you. It was not about missing the company. It was more like letting the air readjust. When someone comes into a space and then goes, the space takes a moment to return to itself. You had learned to give it that moment, rather than immediately picking up the next task. The bottles were where you'd left them. The candles on the counter needed lighting. The afternoon had deepened enough that the light was now doing more suggesting than illuminating. You reached for the taper and the small tinder box you kept on the shelf below the counter. One candle. The wax caught easily, and the flame settled into itself without fussing. A second candle, near the back where the shadows collected first. You held the taper for a moment, considering a third, then decided 2 was right for now. Too much candlelight too early made the evening feel theatrical. 2 candles felt lived in. You set the taper in the small dish beside the tinder box and looked at the shop in the new light. Candlelight did something specific to the bottles. In daylight they were practical things, useful, purposeful, part of a working shop. By candlelight, they became something else. The amber glass glowed. The violet of the grief-ease tincture deepened to something almost purple-black, mysterious and still. The little vials of clarity tonic caught the flame and scattered small bright points across the ceiling, like the suggestion of stars. The warmth draught on the end of the row glowed exactly as its name promised. You allowed yourself another moment of quiet looking. There was a sound from Sable Street, a cart, the hollow knock of wheels on cobblestone, fading left toward the harbour road. Then a voice, indistinct, cheerful. Then nothing. The street resumed its autumn late-afternoon quiet, which was different from the summer late-afternoon quiet in the way that autumn and summer were generally different, where summer quiet was relaxed, sprawled, comfortable with itself. Autumn quiet was gathered, settled, a quality of things coming indoors. You thought, momentarily, about the summer just past. It had been a good summer. The mornings foggy and the afternoons warm the way they nearly always were, and the shop busy with the people who came back to Thistlewick every summer. Old residents returned for visits, cousins and grown children of people you knew, the occasional traveller who had heard of the harbour town at the base of the grey mountains and come to see what it was like. Some of them came into the shop out of curiosity, wanting to look at the bottles, and some of them bought something, and some of them came back. There was a woman from some distance away who had discovered the grief-ease tincture 3 summers ago, and who came back every August to restock. She didn't talk much about what the tincture was for. You didn't ask. She took it home in the small 6-month bottle, and she always arrived looking a little worn, and she always left looking a little steadier, and that was exactly what the grief-ease was meant to do. You went to the back room to check on the infusion. The back room of the potion shop was smaller than the main shop, and cooler and darker, and smelled of a completely different set of things. The green, slightly damp smell of herbs that had not yet been dried, the rich brown smell of the storage crocks, something medicinal and mineral underneath. The shelves here were rougher than the ones out front, plain wood, unpainted, deep enough to hold the large crocks in which the long infusions were made. An infusion was a slower thing than a potion. A potion could be made in a session, a few hours at the work table, specific heat, specific timing, attention. An infusion took weeks, sometimes months. You set something in a crock with the right things around it, and you sealed it, and you waited, and time did most of the work that fire would have done if you'd been in a hurry. The crock you were checking on had been sealed for 11 days. It sat in the back corner of the shelf, a large round crock of pale clay, sealed with wax and labelled in your smallest hand. Consolation. 11th day. Check seal. You leaned in and looked at the seal. It was intact, the wax still smooth, no cracks, no discoloration that would indicate something had gone wrong inside. You pressed your palm lightly against the side of the crock, feeling its temperature. Cooler than the main room. Steady. Good. The consolation infusion was not a regular item in the shop. You made it rarely, only when the need presented itself, and you had only made it a handful of times over the years. It was not for grief exactly, and not for loneliness exactly, but for something that sat between the two, the feeling of a space that has been empty for long enough that you have almost stopped noticing it, except that sometimes, without warning, you notice it very much. You had made it this time because of Willa, actually. Not for her, since Marin had asked for the sleep draught, and that was the right thing for now, but because Willa's situation had reminded you that consolation was sometimes needed, and that it was better to have it ready than to begin the 11-day process when someone was already in the middle of needing it. You placed the back of your hand against the crock one more time. 11 more days, perhaps 12. It would be ready before the frost. You returned to the main room. The harbour bell rang 5 o'clock. The sound came through the walls with its familiar weight, and you counted the 5 rings without meaning to, the way you always did, your body keeping track. The light outside the window had gone from gold to something softer and less certain, the particular ambiguity of early evening in autumn, when the sun is too low to see but not yet fully gone, when the sky becomes a medium for colour rather than light. Purple, you thought, looking at the little strip of sky visible above the alley, or the beginning of purple, something working up to it. You opened the door for a moment, just for the air, just for a breath of Thistlewick at 5 o'clock on an autumn evening, and stood in the doorway, the shop warm at your back. The alley was quiet. Sable Street was just visible at the end of it, and you could see the edge of the lamplight from the one lamp that the lamplighter always reached early, the one at the corner of Sable and Ink Lane. Someone was passing. A dark coat, unhurried. The faint sound of a cart being pulled somewhere further away. And underneath all of it, the smell, wood smoke, beginning now, from the houses starting their fires for the evening. Salt from the harbour, which was always there, always underneath. And something crisper than it had been this morning, the evening air sharpening, drawing in. Marin was right. There was weather coming. You breathed it in once, and then you stepped back inside and let the door close behind you. You had another task before the evening settled in properly. The weekly order from the Greenmere apothecary. You had been putting it off, not from reluctance, but from that particular tendency to save pleasant tasks for when you most need them, and you had not most needed it until now. The Greenmere apothecary across the square supplied your dried herbs, or most of them, the ones you couldn't grow yourself, or that grew better in the drier air of the hillside gardens they maintained behind their shop. 3 generations of Greenmeres, and all of them good growers, all of them with the particular patience that growing things required. You worked with them the way you worked with Marin, with the ease of a long arrangement, a relationship built up over years into something that functioned without needing to be explained. The order list was on a small folded paper in your apron pocket. You had been adding to it all week. You spread it on the counter and read through it. Dried calendula, the large bunch, not the small. The valerian was getting low, had been low since the beginning of the month. You needed more than last time. The skullcap was almost gone. And there was a new request on the list, one you'd added just this morning. Dried linden flowers, if they had them, which they might not, since linden was a summer bloom and the season had just passed. You would ask. You folded the paper again and tucked it away. The linden flower was for something you were working on in a preliminary way, not yet a full recipe, more like an idea with potential. Something for the transition between waking and sleeping, not the sleep draught, which brought sleep on deliberately and completely, but something softer. Something for the liminal place. The linden flower was for the feeling of being almost asleep, of being on the pleasant edge of it, aware but unbothered. You had that feeling sometimes when you sat in the chair by the brazier on a slow evening. You wanted to put it in a bottle. It was still an idea. But ideas needed starting somewhere. You looked at the list one more time, decided it was right, and put it in your pocket for tomorrow's visit." The door opened again, the bell chiming its single clear note. This time it was a young man you knew only in the way you knew most of the town, by sight, by small accumulated details, by a handful of previous visits. His name was Cress. He lived on Fenwick Lane, in the second cottage from the bottom, the one with the blue door that was always slightly ajar in summer. He was perhaps 20, maybe 22, with a quiet way about him and ink-stained fingers that suggested he spent time in the ink quarter, though you did not know precisely where or in what capacity. He came in looking the way people sometimes came into the shop, a little uncertain, as though not entirely sure his particular need was the kind of thing the shop could address, as though he had almost turned back on the way here and decided at the last moment not to. "Good evening," you said. "Good evening," he replied. He stood just inside the door for a moment, looking at the shelves with a familiar expression, the searching look, the waiting to see what would catch. You let him look. This was important. One of the things you had learned over the years was that many people needed to be in the shop for a little while before they knew what they had come for. The coming in was often not yet the knowing. You gave people time, and you stood quietly at the counter, and you let the shop do its work. The shop did its work by simply being what it was. The candlelight and the smell and the particular quality of stillness that existed in a room full of small glass bottles were not nothing. They had an effect. You had seen it many times. A person would come in tense or distracted or unsure, and after a minute or two of standing in the shop, their shoulders would drop. Their breathing would slow. They would look at the shelves with a different kind of attention, no longer searching, but receiving. Cress stood for a moment more, and his shoulders dropped. After a moment, he came to the counter. "I'm not entirely sure what I need," he said. He said it with the slightly embarrassed directness of someone who had decided that honesty was the better approach and was not entirely comfortable with it. "That's all right," you said. "Most people aren't, when they first come in." "It's not. I'm not unwell," he said, as though clarifying. "It's more like—" He paused. You waited. "I've been working on something," he said. "Something I care about. And I've been working on it for a long time, and I'm close. I think I'm close, but I keep losing the thread. I'll have it, and then I'll sit down at the desk and it's gone, or it's there but it's wrong, or I start to think it was never right in the first place, which I know isn't true. But knowing it isn't true doesn't stop the feeling." He said all of this carefully, as though he had been thinking about how to say it for some time. You nodded. You understood. It was not an uncommon thing, this particular tangle of nearness and doubt, the feeling of circling something you could see but couldn't quite reach. You had felt it yourself over the years, with preparations that resisted finishing. The Griefese tincture had taken 3 attempts before it found its correct proportions. The first 2 batches had worked, after a fashion, but not in the right way, not with the particular quality you knew was possible and were trying to locate. The difference between a thing that worked and a thing that was right was sometimes everything, and the gap between the two was where Cress seemed to be living right now. "The clarity tincture," you said, without preamble. You reached for the shelf and brought one of the small vials down and set it on the counter. He looked at it, at the way the candlelight moved through it, the small points of light it scattered on the ceiling. "That's the one," he said quietly, as though he'd recognized it without knowing what he was looking for. "It won't do the work for you," you told him, "because you always told people this. That's not what it does. It just clears the surface, takes away the noise that isn't the thing you're trying to hear." "That's what I need," he said. "It's there, the thing I'm trying to do. I can feel it. I just can't." He stopped. Then, "Yes, that's what I need." You named the price. He counted it out carefully, correct to the penny, and slid it across the counter. "A quarter measure in a small amount of water," you told him. "In the morning, when you sit down to work. Not every day. Every few days is enough. Give it time between." He nodded, pocketing the vial with a care that you recognized as the beginning of trust. The way people held the first thing they ever bought from the shop, carefully, like it might not be real. "What are you working on?" you asked. It was not the kind of question you always asked, but something in the way he described it, the closeness of it, the thing right at the edge of being reached, made you curious in a way you thought it was worth being honest about. He looked slightly surprised to be asked. Then, after a brief pause, "A map," he said. "Of sorts. Of the bay. Not the harbour. Further out. The shapes of the coast further up the Saltmere, the ones that don't appear on any charts because not many people go there. I've been taking measurements for 2 years, drawing it out for a year. I keep getting the proportions of one particular headland wrong, and every time I think I've fixed it, I come back and look at it again, and it's still wrong, but I can't see exactly where." He stopped, as though unsure whether he'd said too much. "A cartographer," you said. "I'm trying to be," he said. You thought about the Ink Quarter, the cartographer's workshop you had passed many times without ever having reason to go in, the smell of good paper and India ink that lived in those few streets year-round. "You work with Sable at the map house?" "I'm apprenticed there, yes." He paused. "Have been for 3 years. Then the headland will come right," you said. "Not reassurance, exactly. Just the honest arithmetic of 3 years of attention applied to a single problem. It usually does, when someone has been looking long enough. Something in his expression settled. Come back and let me know how it goes." He nodded again, and the bell chimed as he went out, and the evening air came in for one cool breath, and then the door closed and it was gone. You stayed at the counter. You were thinking about linden flowers, and about the map of the Saltmere coast, and about how both of them were the same kind of problem. Something real, something true, something that existed and needed only to be found in the right form. The headland was out there on the coast, exactly where it had always been. The feeling of the liminal edge of sleep was real, reproducible, present in your own body on certain evenings when the conditions were right. Cress needed to find the headland's proportions. You needed to find the proportions of a feeling. The clarity tincture, in a sense, was for both of them. This happened sometimes. A visitor would bring a need with them that fit exactly into something you were already thinking about, not because anything magical had arranged it, but because people's needs are not random, and sometimes several people in a town will be circling the same kind of difficulty at the same time without knowing it. The seasons brought things. Autumn brought its particular array. The sleep disruptions, the threads lost in the shortening light, the grief that lived in the gap between how things were and how they would be again come spring. The thing Cress needed, the clarity tincture, was good. It would help. But the thing he had described, underneath what he needed, the being close to something and unable to settle into it, that was the linden thing. That was the liminal quality, the almost asleep, the threshold feeling. Not for work. For the moment before sleep, when the day's work rose up and could either become tomorrow's clarity or tomorrow's confusion, depending on how the night went. You made a small note on the edge of the order paper. Linden, 2 bunches if possible. Ask Greenmere. The harbour bell rang 6. You put more water on for tea. A different blend this time, the valerian and passion flower combination you made for yourself on evenings when the day had been full in the particular way that made the head feel slightly loud. Not too strong. Just enough. You measured it by feel, the way you measured most things for yourself, not by any recipe but by the long understanding of what your body asked for. While the tea steeped, you cleaned up the day's work properly. The work table needed wiping. There were faint rings where the measuring cups had sat, a small residue of resin from the morning's clarity batch, a smear of violet at the very edge that had come from the grief-ease work the day before. You used the damp cloth, working from left to right the way you always did, the way the table was marked very faintly by years of this same motion, a slightly lighter strip down the middle where the cleaning had worn the wood a little. The measuring spoons, rinsed and dried. The small stone pestle, which you'd used yesterday for the dried valerian, and which still held the faint ghost of that smell, green and bitter and oddly clean. The glass rods for stirring. The funnel. The sieve. Each thing went to its place. There was deep pleasure in this, in the returning of things, everything belonging somewhere specific, and everything going back. A room properly tidied at the end of a day was its own kind of accomplishment, different from the accomplishments of making or selling, quieter than those but perhaps more durable. The shop looked after, put to rights, ready for tomorrow. You poured the tea and took it to the chair by the brazier. The chair was large and a little battered, upholstered in a dark green that had faded to something more interesting over the years, worn at the armrests to a lighter shade where hands had rested. The cushion had been replaced twice. The frame was the original, and it had a slight give in the left rear leg that you had learned to account for, the way you had learned to account for so many things in this building, its settling, its quirks, the particular places where it was not quite level, and the particular places where that stopped mattering. You sat. The brazier was low but warm, the embers casting a red-orange light that competed gently with the candles, and one in the immediate vicinity of the chair, turning everything nearby a little warmer in colour. The shop smelled of the chamomile from Marin's tea, and of the taper that had burned down a little since you'd lit it, and faintly of the valerian from the spoon you'd cleaned, and underneath all of it, always, the beeswax and the amber resin and the old wood. You took a sip of the tea, passion flower and valerian, with a little honey because you had reached for the honey jar without quite deciding to. The taste was not unpleasant, green, slightly bitter, softened by the honey into something almost floral. It spread warmth through the chest, down toward the stomach, the way valerian always did. Not dramatically, not insistently, just the gentle loosening of something that had been slightly held. You breathed out. Through the window, the alley had gone properly dark now, the last of the skylight gone. The single lamp at the corner of Sable and Ink Lane was visible as a warm smear through the wavy old glass, blurred and amber and comfortable. You could hear the harbour, distantly, the creak of boats, the movement of water against the dockside stones, a sound so constant in Thistlewick that you heard it mostly in your sleep, or in the space between sounds, or when you stopped to listen for it deliberately as you were doing now. The harbour at night. It had been there all your life, that sound, and the lives before yours that had been in this shop. You thought about that sometimes, the accumulation of evenings in this room, the long count of sittings by the fire, of kettles put on and teas drunk and days wound down. The walls held all of it, the way old walls do, not in any mystical sense, or not only in a mystical sense, but in the plain material sense. Things that happen in a room leave traces, the way a person leaves a trace on a stool by sitting on it every week for years, wearing it to the shape of themselves. The shop knew you. You found this comforting. You were still sitting with your tea, thinking no particular thoughts in the pleasant and slightly loose way that Valerian permitted, when you heard footsteps on Sable Street slow and stop. You waited. The knock at the door was quiet. Not tentative exactly, but considerate. The knock of someone who understood it was evening, who did not want to impose and was knocking anyway because the need was there. You set down your mug and went to the door. The woman on the other side was Dorla Kemp, who kept the candlery 3 doors down on Sable Street. You knew her well. She had been your neighbour on this street for years, a broad-shouldered woman with a steady presence and a smell of beeswax that she carried with her everywhere, as unavoidable as a calling card. She made the best beeswax candles in Thistlewick, which was a point of unspoken mutual appreciation between you, since the candles you burned in the shop were hers. She was holding a small bundle under one arm, wrapped in brown paper, and she looked slightly embarrassed to be there, which was unlike her. "I know it's late," she said. "It's not late. Come in. I'll only be a moment." She came in anyway, stepping past you into the warmth of the shop, and stopped in the middle of it the way people sometimes did, taking it in, letting the smell do its work. The smell of beeswax on her and the smell of beeswax in the shop met somewhere in the middle and became a single, richer thing, the smell of something that had been made well. "I needed," she started. Then she shook her head, faintly. "I don't know what I needed, exactly." "That's all right. I've been off today," she said. "Not unwell. Just not quite right. Like the thread on a spindle when it's been wound slightly wrong. Everything catches a little." You looked at her for a moment. Dorla was rarely off. She was one of the most even-tempered people you knew. Her work required it, the careful and patient work of the chandler, which could not be rushed or hurried without ruining things, and which had over the years made her into someone who did not rush or hurry anything. When she said she was off today, she meant something specific, something slight but real. The warmth draught, you said, not the grief ease, which was for something heavier, not the sleep draught, which addressed the symptom rather than the cause. The warmth draught, which was for this specific quality of feeling, the slight wrongness, the subtle sense of being misaligned, the thread catching on itself. You went to the shelf and took the last amber bottle from the row you'd labelled this afternoon. The good batch, the one that had come out exactly right. You set it on the counter in front of her. She looked at it. Then she looked at you. There was something in her expression that was not quite surprise, but was close to it, the particular expression of someone who had come in without knowing what they needed and found that the shop knew before they did. "The colour," she said softly. "Good batch today. I can see that. She picked it up and turned it slowly in the candlelight. The amber gold of it was warm and real, and it caught the flame the way good glass catches flame, not just reflecting it, but participating in it, briefly making the light its own. I've had days where I came in and the warmth draught was pale, and it worked, but distantly. This one won't be distant. She nodded, set it back on the counter, and reached into the pocket of her coat for the coins. She knew the price, had always known the price, though it had changed once, 3 winters ago, when you'd had to raise it, and she had paid the new price without comment, which you had quietly noted and appreciated. What did you do differently today? You thought about it honestly. I don't know, you said. Sometimes they come out right, and I can't trace the reason. The same measurements, the same heat, the same attention. And some days the attention is different without knowing it. More present, maybe. A good day at the work. A good day at the work. She slid the coins across the counter. You took them. The bundle under her arm shifted, and she remembered it. Oh, I brought you something. I was going to drop it off anyway, but... She held it out. New batch. 8-hour burn on these. I added a little something to the scent. You took the bundle and folded back one edge of the paper. 6 candles, cream-coloured, thick and smooth, the way her best work always was. The surface of each one was matte and even, without the slight texture you sometimes saw in rushed work. These had been made slowly, poured in the right conditions, cooled without being disturbed. You could see the quality before you even smelled them, and the scent rising immediately from the paper. Beeswax as always, but with something underneath it, something you had to lean in to identify. Linden, you said. She looked pleased. From the last of the summer blooms. I dried some, experimented a little. It gives the wax a quality. I don't know how to describe it. Softer, maybe. Like the air just before you fall asleep. You looked at her. Then you looked at the candles. I was thinking about Linden this afternoon, you said. She tilted her head. For something I'm working on. A feeling I'm trying to bottle. You turned one of the candles in your hands, feeling the weight of it. Substantial, good, a candle that would last. The liminal place. The edge of sleep. I've been thinking about linden flowers since this morning, and I wasn't sure why. She was quiet for a moment. And I've been burning linden wax in the workroom all day, she said. I didn't think much of it. The summer blooms were good this year, and I dried more than I needed, and this morning I tried putting some of the powder in the wax, and I liked it. You looked at the candle in your hands, then back at her, and her expression was the particular one of someone discovering an unexpected convergence, a point where 2 different lines of thought, followed independently and unknowingly, had arrived at the same place. She said. You agreed. There was a comfortable pause, the kind that contained more than it appeared to, not mystical, or not entirely. Just the particular thing that happened sometimes in Thistlewick, which was old enough that its inhabitants had learned to follow their own inclinations without knowing why, and occasionally found that they had been following them toward the same point, along different routes. Light one tonight, she said. See what you think. I will. Well, she said at last, I'll let you get back to your evening." She picked up the bottle from the counter. You had almost forgotten she'd set it down, and tucked it into her coat pocket. "Thank you. Thank you for the candles." She nodded, and the bell above the door chimed as she left, and you stood for a moment with the 6 linden candles wrapped in brown paper and thought about the strange ordinaries of convergence. 2 people on the same small street in the same small town, thinking about the same flower without knowing it. Not magic, or not only magic, just Thistlewick, being itself. You took one of Dorla's new candles and lit it from the taper on the counter. The scent came into the room slowly, the way good things came, without announcing itself, arriving at the edges of your awareness first, and then, by the time you noticed it fully, already present and right. Beeswax, and underneath it the linden, something delicate, a little sweet, with a quality that was hard to name except by the sensation it produced, which was, yes, that, the feeling of being on the pleasant edge of sleep, of the day having gone soft at its margins, of things being, for the moment, exactly as much as they needed to be and no more. You put the other 5 candles under the counter, in the drawer where you kept the extra tapers. Then you stood at the counter for a moment and breathed. The shop smelled like itself, plus the linden. It was an addition that did not alter anything. It just completed something, the way a final note completes a chord. The candles on the counter burned steadily, no draughts disturbing them. The brazier glowed. The bottles on the shelves were quiet in the candlelight. You thought about tomorrow's order list, the Greenmere apothecary, the linden flowers, if they had them. You added a note. Also, ask Dorla about the dried linden. If she has extra, can borrow some while I wait for the order. Good. That was the beginning of the liminal thing. Not tonight, not this week, but beginning. The shop was quiet for a while after that. You used the time in the way that you used quiet stretches in the shop, not by sitting, not yet, but by moving slowly through tasks that required no thought and therefore gave the mind room to settle into itself. You refilled the small bottle of ink that you kept on the counter for labeling. You checked the level of the lamp oil in the lamp on the window ledge, found it low, and refilled it from the can in the back. You opened the window above the drying rack for 2 minutes, the cool evening air coming in sharp and clean and salt-edged, and then closed it again, because the linden candle was exactly right and you didn't want the harbour smell to compete with it. The harbour smell was lovely. But tonight was a linden night. You were behind the counter, sorting the small corks by size into their respective jars, a task that was never strictly necessary since you generally knew by feel which size was which, when the bell above the door sounded again. You looked up. It was old Fenwick himself. He came in the way old men came into small shops they had been visiting for decades. Slowly, with the settled deliberateness of someone who had no intention of being hurried by anything, including time. He was in his winter coat already, the heavy brown one with the worn collar, and he was carrying his walking stick, which he used less for balance than for the company of it. He was, you thought, the oldest person you knew who still came to the shop under his own power, which he was very aware of, and which gave him a quiet satisfaction that showed in the set of his chin. He looked around the shop with the slow, approving expression he always wore on entering it, as though checking that things were as they should be. "Evening," he said. "Good evening. Come in out of the cold." "I am in," he said mildly, stepping further from the door to demonstrate. He moved to the counter at a pace that was unhurried without being slow, the pace of someone who has made peace with the speed at which they move and finds it adequate. He settled his hands on the counter, the walking stick hooked over his arm, and looked at you. "How's the shop?" "Good week," you said. "Good week for everyone," he said. "Season's right. People want things in autumn." He said it without any particular profundity, as a simple observation of many years. He had grown up in Thistlewick, had watched it from the Fenwick house at the top of the lane for his entire long life, and he had the particular authority of someone who has seen a thing through enough of its repetitions to know it thoroughly. "The bread's back," you said. His expression warmed. "Since Tuesday. I had the first loaf myself. Elvira brought it up." Elvira was his granddaughter, who ran the bakery now, though old Fenwick had strong and frequently expressed opinions about the autumn spice bread recipe, and believed himself to be its primary custodian despite not having made it personally for upward of 15 years. "Better than last year?" "Same as last year," he said, with the slight hedge of someone who would have preferred it to be better. "Which is to say, good." You smiled. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a small folded paper, the kind he always brought in when he needed something specific. He set it on the counter between you. "2 things," he said. "The valerian for sleeping, same as always, and something else." He tapped the paper. "Written it down because I forget things now." You unfolded the paper, in a hand that was shaky but legible, in the careful way of someone who still cared about legibility. Valerian sleep blend. Also something for the hands. Cold weather, stiff. Don't want liniment. Smells too strong. You read it, folded it again, set it back. "I have something for the hands," you said. "Not a liniment. A warm oil, rosemary and calendula, mostly. Mild smell, almost nothing. Rub it in at night before you sleep." He nodded slowly. "I'll try it." You went to the back room and found the small bottle of the hand oil. It was not something you sold often, but you kept a supply because it was simple to make and genuinely helpful, and because in winter the fishermen and the older residents of Thistlewick developed a need for it that was consistent and real. Cold harbour air did particular things to hands. There was nothing mysterious about the oil. It worked because of what was in it: the rosemary for warmth and circulation, the calendula for the skin, and it had no magical properties beyond these, which was the right kind of preparation for something so practical. You brought it out and set it beside the valerian blend on the counter. Old Fenwick picked up the small oil bottle and turned it in his hands, opened it and smelled. "Rosemary," he said, "and calendula. Very mild." He recapped it and nodded, satisfied. He paid for both items from the coin purse in his inside pocket, the one that took him a moment to locate, which you waited for without appearing to wait, which was the correct way to wait for someone who needed a moment. "Cold coming," he said, as he tucked the bottles away. "Rain tonight. Frost after, Marin thinks. Marin's usually right about weather." He picked up his walking stick and turned toward the door, which you moved to hold for him, not because he needed it held, but because holding it felt like a small and proper courtesy between people who had known each other a long time. "Night, then. Good night. Sleep well." He made a sound that indicated he intended to try, and then he stepped out onto Sable Street, and the cold air came briefly in, and the door closed behind him. You stood for a moment. 4 visitors in one afternoon. Marin, Cress, Dorla, Old Fenwick. Each of them with something different, each of them leaving with exactly what they'd needed, one of them not knowing until they arrived what they needed at all. This was the shop at its best. Not dramatic, not miraculous, just useful in the quiet and specific way that made it worth coming to. A long street with various doors on it, and this one at the end, with the faded sign and the crooked sign in the window, and the bottles inside catching the light. You leaned against the counter for a moment, and just let yourself feel the rightness of the evening. Then you went to the back room to check on the infusion. The harbour bell rang 7. You went to the back room and checked the evening tasks, the ones that didn't take long but that needed doing before you closed. The large infusion crock, sealed and steady, 11 days and counting. The herb bundles you'd pulled yesterday to dry, still hanging, still doing what drying herbs did, which was wait. They were patient things, herbs. They did not rush toward their purpose. They arrived at it when they arrived. The small clay jar of the newest experiment, not yet anything, just an idea in water, sitting on the back shelf with a rough label that said only Linden in your smallest hand. Now it seemed less like a question. You came back into the main room and checked the candles. The linden one was burning well, steady and low and even. The others were good. You put one out, the one on the far end of the counter that was burning at an angle, and left the rest. You swept the floor. This was the last task of the day, always. The broom was old, older than almost anything else in the shop, its handle worn smooth, its bristles stiff and reliable. You swept from back to front, from the corners inward, from the shelves outward, the way you had been taught and the way you had always done, taking up the fine dust that accumulated in a place where dried herbs lived, and the occasional small bit of wax or cork, and whatever the day had brought in on the soles of shoes. The sound of the broom on the stone floor was rhythmic and even, a sound that meant the day was closing, that meant the shop was being returned to itself. You swept the small pile to the door. Tomorrow. Tonight the pile could wait. You set the broom back in its corner and looked at what you'd done. Clean enough. Good. The fire in the brazier needed banking before you went upstairs. This was a careful process, not putting it out exactly, but reducing it to something that would smoulder safely through the night without needing attention. You had done it so many times that your hands knew the order without instruction. Push the coals together first, so they share their heat. Add 1 piece of the small dry wood from the stack beside the wall, just one, enough to keep a bed of warmth. Then the metal plate over the top, not tight, just resting to slow the airflow. The fire accepted this and settled down into itself, glowing lower but steadily. You straightened up and looked at the shop in its evening state. The single linden candle on the counter, the brazier low behind you, the bottles dim and quiet on the shelves. The window onto the alley dark now, only the smear of the distant lamp visible. The broom in its corner, the stool at the end of the counter, the chair by the brazier in which you had sat. Everything in its place. You put on your coat. It was cold enough for the coat now, even just going up the stairs, and you reached for the sign in the window. Open, the painted letters said, a little faded. You turned it to closed, and then you paused. There was a sound outside, on Sable Street. Not alarming, just rain. You stood still for a moment, listening. It had started quietly, as rain in Thistlewick often did. A preliminary whisper on the stones, almost nothing, a testing of the air. And then it settled into itself, becoming the soft, steady percussion you knew from 100 autumn evenings. Rain on the cobblestones of Sable Street, rain on the tile roofs of the shops, rain coming down the alley between the chandlery and the potion shop in a small rush that would find the drain at the corner and disappear. Marin had been right. Rain first, then frost. You stood at the door and listened to it for a long moment without opening the door, because rain through glass was a different experience from rain on your face, and what you wanted right now was the muffled version, the rain as the shop heard it, mediated by old walls and old glass, softened into texture rather than sensation. The particular music of weather happening at a comfortable distance. The linden candle on the counter was still burning. In its light, with the sound of the rain, the shop had arrived at something. You were not sure what to call it. A mood, an atmosphere, a feeling that sat quietly in the room and asked for nothing, only that you notice it. You noticed it. Upstairs, your rooms were warm from the day's heat rising. You had a small fireplace up here too, and you put a match to the kindling that was already laid. You laid it fresh every morning, another small habit, another thing that happened without decision, and it caught quickly, a bright and brief announcement of itself before settling into something more sustained and lower. The kettle here was smaller than the one downstairs. You filled it from the jug and set it on the trivet over the flames. Your rooms were comfortable in the way that rooms accumulate comfort over years, not by design, or not only by design, but by habitation, by the choice, made many times and then forgotten as a choice, to put a particular chair in a particular spot, by the mat on the floor beside the bed, worn at the edges but still good, by the quilt, which was large and old and had been made by someone you had loved long ago, and which still held warmth better than any blanket you had bought since. You went to the window while the fire established itself. From up here, the view was different from the one in the shop below. The alley was visible at an angle, and beyond it the roof line of the building across Sable Street, and above that a slice of the sky that was now fully dark, clouds moving across it with the purposeful slowness of weather that had somewhere to be. You could see the corner lamp from up here too, its glow amber and constant through the rain that had started in earnest now, the drops on the window-pane making the lamp's light fracture and multiply into something like many small lights instead of one. You watched this for a while. Rain on glass was one of the oldest pleasures. Not dramatic, not particularly interesting in any analytical sense, just the water finding its way down the pane in the particular paths that water chose, each drop forging a route based on the invisible topography of the glass, joining other drops or striking out independently, gathering speed or slowing, never quite predictable. You could watch it for a long time without needing it to do anything else. The fire was going properly now, and the room had caught up with it, the chill at the edges retreating. You set out the mug you used up here. Different from the ones downstairs, these were purely personal, an unmatched set of two that had survived many years and one move and a winter where the shelves had not held properly, and measured out a small amount of the chamomile into the strainer. Just chamomile tonight. Simple. The passion flower and valerian blend from earlier had already done its work, and what you wanted now was something without agenda, something that tasted like itself and made no promises beyond warmth. The kettle was beginning its preliminary murmur. You sat in the small chair by the window while it heated and looked at your rooms. The shelves along the west wall held the personal things, not potion materials, those stayed in the shop, but the accumulation of a life in one place. Books, many of them. Some about plants and their properties, reference texts worn soft at the spines from frequent consultation. Some not about anything practical. Histories, journals, a few books of illustrated drawings of coastal birds that you had never used for any purpose, but that you had always found simply good to own. There was a small wooden box on the second shelf that held seeds from the year's herb garden, seeds you'd saved and labelled in the same careful hand you used for the shop labels. There was a photograph of unknown provenance that had been here when you moved in, showing a harbour that might be Thistlewick and might be somewhere else, in weather that was clearly summer. You had never found out whose it was. It had been there for so long that it felt like yours. On the top shelf, a row of small objects. A piece of sea glass, the particular turquoise that only came from glass that had been in the water a very long time. A stone with a natural hole through its centre, found on the harbour beach. A small dried seed pod from the forest witch's garden, which she had given you when you moved into these rooms as a sort of housewarming, saying it was for good making, whatever you might be making, and which had sat on the shelf ever since and seemed, in some non-quantifiable way, to keep its promise. The kettle came to its whistle, soft and steady. You made the tea and carried it to the chair by the fire. The fire had settled into itself properly now, no longer performing, just burning, the logs that had caught giving themselves over to it steadily. The sound was the low, settled sound of a fire that has found its rhythm, a slow creak, occasionally a soft pop, the constant low breath of it against the grate. You sat. The mug was warm in both hands. You took the first sip. Just chamomile. Good. The room held the particular quietness of a room above a closed shop, which was a specific kind of quiet. The shop below was silent now, not empty exactly, since the infusion crock was there doing its work and the candle was still burning. One candle, you had checked, the linden one, on the saucer where it could safely burn itself out, and the bottles were quietly being whatever they were when no one was watching, but functionless for the night, no longer receiving visitors or performing its work of matching needs to remedies. Just resting. You thought about what Marin had said, about Willa and the first winter. You thought about Cress and the headland on his map that wouldn't come right, the proportions stubborn and wrong in a way he could see but not locate. There was something you recognized in that description, not from cartography, which you had never practiced, but from the Griefese tincture, in those early batches where it worked but not quite, where you could feel the offness of it without being able to put your finger on where. The clarity tincture would help him, you thought, not because it would show him the answer, but because it would quiet the noise around the answer until the answer could be heard. You thought about old Fenwick and the hand oil, and whether the rosemary would help. It usually did. The calendula would help more, for the skin. The combination was right. You had made it the same way for years, and it had never failed to do what it said it would do. There was comfort in things that reliably did what they said they would do. The fire popped. The rain on the window continued, unhurried. Outside, the town was settling. You could not hear it from up here in any specific way. No voices, no carts, no particular sound that named itself. But you could feel the settling the way you felt the harbour, the way long familiarity made a place present in a sense beyond the sensory. the lights going out one by one in the windows of Sable Street. The Thistle and Tide taproom winding toward its last hour, Bramble Oast banking the fire in the taproom hearth the way he banked it every night, the fishermen pulling on their coats and heading home along the harbour road, the library long closed, Bindle in his window, the bakery already beginning its early preparations for tomorrow, Elvira Fenwick, who woke before the rest of the town, who was perhaps already in the kitchen below the bakery putting the first things in order for the morning loaves. The autumn spice bread. Tomorrow you would smell it from the window above the shop if the wind was right. You finished the tea. The mug was lighter and cooler in your hands, and you set it on the small table beside the chair, the one with the ring on it from years of mugs, a perfect pale circle that had been there since before you. You put your feet up on the small stool and let your head rest against the back of the chair. The fire, the rain, the smell of chamomile in the room, fading now but still there, a soft and residual warmth in the air. You thought about the liminal preparation, not planning it, not working it through, just letting it be present in your thoughts the way ideas needed to be present before they could become anything, loosely, without urgency, held at the edge of attention rather than placed at the centre of it. The linden flowers, the quality they produced in Dorla's candles, that specific softness, that sense of being held on the pleasant side of sleep. The question was whether that quality could be extracted into water, into something drinkable, or whether it belonged only to the air, to smoke and scent. You thought it could be extracted. You had a feeling about it, not certainty, just the directional sense of something workable, the same sense you'd had about the grief-ease tincture years ago before you'd figured out its proportions. A leaning toward. The proportions would need to be careful. The linden was gentle, not potent, and so the preparation would need to let gentleness be enough, not try to concentrate it into something stronger, not try to amplify. Just receive what the linden offered and make it available in a form people could take home with them. You would call it something when it was done, not liminal, which was what you'd seen in the half-dream. That was the dream's word. In the waking world you'd find the right one, the one that named it accurately without naming it too much. The best preparations had names like that, not too literal, not too ornate. Sleep draught, grief ease, warmth draught. The names were almost plain. They said what the thing was, and trusted the thing to say the rest. Something for the edge, something for the in-between. You would find the name when you had made the thing. The fire was lower now. Not banked, not yet. That was the last task before you slept, the last thing you did each night, banking the coals the same way you banked the ones in the brazier below. You did it last because the warmth was useful right until the moment you were ready not to need it any more, and because it was a deliberate act, a conscious closing of something, a way of marking the end of the waking part of the night. You were not quite ready yet. You sat a little longer in the chair, in the warmth that was still there, in the sound of the rain and the sound of the fire together, which made a particular combination that was one of the things you associated most deeply with this room and this season. Rain outside, fire inside. The two sounds different in quality. Rain distributed, continuous, everywhere. Fire concentrated, irregular, here, but complementary in a way you had never been able to precisely describe and had never needed to. It simply worked. They belonged together the way some things belonged, without explanation. The harbour bell rang 9 o'clock. You counted without counting. Your body knew. 9 o'clock. The deep evening. The harbour settling onto itself, the boats sighing at their moorings, the water making its slow, patient sounds against the stone of the dockside. The mountains behind the town holding the clouds that were bringing the rain, the same mountains that had always been there, older than the town, older than any naming of them. The bramble at the eastern edge, dark and quietly alive the way forests were alive at night, not threatening, just present, attentive in its way. The forest witch's cottage with its never-cold hearth, a light in the window, the smell of bread or something warm drifting through her garden, through the trees, dissolving into the rain. All of it here, all of it continuing. You stood up slowly. The fire needed banking. You did it carefully, the same way you always did. Pushed the coals together, one small piece of the dry wood, the metal plate settling into place. The fire accepted this and went lower, glowing red-orange, steady and safe. You looked at the room, the chair, the shelves, the sea glass on the top shelf catching a little of the firelight and holding it, very faintly turquoise even in the dark, the stone with the hole, the dried seed pod from the forest witch's garden, for good making. You went to the window and looked out one more time. Rain. The lamp at the corner, amber through the water on the glass. The dark roof lines of Sable Street. No one out now, no footsteps, no voices. Just the rain and the town and the harbour below it all, the water that had been here before the town and would be hereafter. You let the curtain fall. You unfolded the quilt. It was exactly as heavy as it always was. The specific weight of old quilting, of many layers of fabric, of the warmth that had been stored in it from last night and the night before and all the nights before those. You spread it over yourself and let your shoulders come down from wherever they had been all day, from the slight readiness that the daytime required, into the simple heaviness of rest. The fire was low but present. The rain continued. There was nothing in the shop to worry about. The infusion crock was sealed. The candles were either out or burning safely and low. The brazier was banked. The closed sign was facing Sable Street. The bottles were in their places on their slightly leaning shelves, and the warmth draught on the end was the right colour, and the sleep draughts were ready for whoever came to need them, and the linden idea was in its earliest form, but it was begun. Old Fenwick had his hand oil and his valerian blend. Willa had her sleep draught, via Marin's careful hands. Cress had his clarity tincture and his headland, and all the mornings ahead of him in the cottage with the blue door, sitting down to the map with the surface cleared. And Dorla, 3 doors down, had the warmth draught on the amber-gold evening when she needed it most. Tomorrow there would be the Greenmere order, and the morning tasks, and whoever the day brought to the door, and all the small work that kept things running without anyone noticing. But that was tomorrow. Here is what you knew, in this moment, in this chair, in this room above the potion shop on Sable Street in the town of Thistlewick. You knew the sound of the rain, which was steady and patient, and had been raining since long before you were born over this harbour, and would be raining long after, the same rain cycling back through cloud and sea and sky. You knew the sound of your own fire, which was particular to this fireplace and to the wood from the stack beside it, which Rennick at the harbour delivered twice a year, and which burned with a particular smell, a little salt in the wood from the sea air it had dried in. You knew the creak of the 3rd stair in the staircase going down, which had creaked for as long as this building had stood, and would creak for as long as it stood further. You knew the smell of the shop rising even up here. Beeswax, chamomile, something that was simply the smell of old meaningful work, the smell of 10,000 tinctures and draughts and infusions, the smell of help given and received. You knew this. You held it. The tea was warm, and the fire was warm, and the quilt was where you would unfold it in a few minutes when the warmth of the fire had fully settled the room, and the rain outside was doing what rain did, which was cover everything in a soft and continuous sound that had no beginning and no end, but only the quality of presence. You thought, briefly, about the linden thing, about the batch waiting to be made, the idea waiting to become something real, about the Greenmere order tomorrow, about Cress and the clarity tincture and what he was making in the cottage with the blue door, about Willa and the sleep draught and the particular tiredness that wasn't about sleep, about old Rennick and his new red boat, standing on the dock for an hour just looking at it, and how right that was, about Dorla, arriving with beeswax and linden, not knowing that you had been thinking about linden all afternoon, about convergences, about the ordinary magic of a small town where people moved through the same streets and breathed the same sea air and came to the same conclusions without knowing they were converging, about Thistlewick being itself. You finished the tea. You unfolded the quilt. It was exactly as heavy as it always was, the specific weight of old quilting, of many layers of fabric, of the warmth that had been stored in it from last night and the night before and all the nights before those. You spread it over yourself and let your shoulders come down from wherever they had been all day, from the slight readiness that the daytime required, into the simple heaviness of rest. The fire was low but present. The rain continued. There was nothing in the shop to worry about. The infusion crock was sealed. The candles were either out or burning safely and low. The brazier was banked. The closed sign was facing Sable Street. The bottles were in their places on their slightly leaning shelves, and the warmth draught on the end was the right colour, and the sleep draughts were ready for whoever came to need them, and the linden idea was in its earliest form, but it was begun. Tomorrow there would be the Greenmere order, and the morning tasks, and whoever the day brought to the door, and all the small work that kept things running without anyone noticing. But that was tomorrow. Right now there was only the weight of the quilt, and the sound of the rain, and the smell of the fire, and the distant, constant presence of the harbour, the creak of boats, the water against stone, which had been the background of everything here for as long as anyone could remember, and which would continue being the background of everything here for as long as anyone could imagine, which was a very long time, and then a little longer. You listened. The rain shifted slightly, a gust of wind somewhere above the town, redirecting things. The sound changed, briefly, and then found itself again, steady and low and everywhere. The harbour bell rang 8 times, far away. You counted them without counting. Your body knew. 8 o'clock. The town settling towards sleep. The lamps lit in windows along Fenwick Lane. The Thistle and Tide taproom warm and quiet, the fire burning well, a few of the fishermen staying late over their cups and saying very little because they had been friends for long enough not to need to say much. The library locked and dark, Bindle inside on his particular window-sill, the one above the cast-iron stove that held warmth until morning. Market Square empty, the cobblestones wet with rain, the old oak standing in the centre with its roots deep in the good dark earth, its branches holding rain and then letting it go, the way it had done for more years than anyone could reliably count. All of it here, all of it continuing. You in the room above the potion shop. the fire beside you, going lower still, the coals moving past flame and into glow, that deep orange red that was the heart of a fire, the part that was warmth without light, or nearly without light, the part that continued long after the visible burning was done. The quilt heavy, the rain patient, your breath slowing. There was a moment, some time later, you could not have said when, time having gone soft and unmeasured, when you were not quite asleep and not quite awake, and you were in the shop, not remembering it, in it, standing at the counter, the candles lit, the linden candle burning, and outside the window it was still raining, and the bottles on the shelves were their familiar selves, amber and violet and pale gold and clear, catching what little light there was and doing something quiet with it. And on the counter in front of you, a bottle, small, unassuming, with a round stopper. The glass was not quite any colour, or it was all of them, slightly, changing depending on the angle, and inside, something that was not liquid exactly, more like light that had agreed to behave like liquid for the moment, swirling slowly, very slowly, as though moved by a current that originated somewhere inside the bottle itself. You did not remember making it, but you must have, because it was here. You reached for it and held it up. The label, in your own careful hand, liminal. The colour inside moved, and in the movement was the quality you had been trying to name all day, the pleasant edge, the threshold, the feeling of being held on the good side of sleep with everything soft around you. You had not made it yet, not really. It was still an idea. But here, in the between place, you could see what it would be. You set the bottle back on the counter, the rain on the window, the fire behind you, warm, everything fine. The rain continued through the night. You slept the way you always slept in this room, in this bed, under this quilt, with a knowledge somewhere below consciousness that you were in the right place, and that the right place was still there when you needed to return to it. You did not dream of anything alarming. You dreamed, if you dreamed at all, of the harbour, and of the colour inside the bottle, and of linden flowers, and of the particular amber gold of the warmth draught catching light, and of Marin on the stool at the end of the counter, and of the creak of the third stair, and of rain. Mostly rain. The rain that had been over Thistlewick for longer than this town, and would be over it when all of this was long gone, and that was falling now on the cobblestones of Sable Street, and on the tile roof of the potion shop, and on the old oak in Market Square, and on the harbour, and on the boats at their moorings, and on the red hull of Rennick's boat, and on the dark bramble at the edge of town, and on the forest witch's cottage with its never-cold hearth, and on the graves on the hill where the old families lay, and on the new gardens of the new family at the top of Fenwick Lane, and on the flat stones the small girl had arranged on the wall, and on the mountains behind the town, and on everything and everyone sleeping below. Just rain. Just Thistlewick. Just this. In the morning there would be the smell of the Fenwick bakery reaching Market Square before 6 o'clock, the autumn spice bread, the one that only came in October. In the morning there would be the harbour bell counting out the hours. In the morning the Greenmere order, and the question about linden flowers, and Dorler at the chandlery next door with the rest of the linden wax, and the clarity tincture on the shelf catching the new day's light. In the morning the infusion crock with 10 more days to go. In the morning whoever the day brought to the door. But first this, the rain, the warmth, the sound of a small harbour town at night, breathing. You are here. You have always been here. Rest now.